Awesome. Well, then welcome and thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to y'all.
Thank you, Joshua. We just want to thank everyone for coming today and listening to us. And we really invite your questions and ideas. We want to acknowledge that there may be things that we may miss in our presentation. I think these are complex issues, and we always want to further improve these conversations so that we can cultivate a better sense of solidarity and justice within intersectional communities and being more inclusive. So we've attached in the chat the slides itself, so you have access to those slides. And you also have our emails if you'd like to reach out to us after the presentation to get more information or remaining conversations. So we really invite you to reach out to us. So as Joshua mentioned, we're here to present on the topic of international LGBTQ plus students across borders. I'm here with my colleagues. Let me see if I can go to the next slide. I'm here with my colleague Ashish, and my other colleague Erica. She's unable to be here today. So first to introduce myself, my name is Hoa Nguyen, and I teach family therapy at Valdosta State University. I use pronouns she, her, and I've gotten to work with Ashish on these issues when we were both students at Virginia Tech, and really focusing on maybe a more underserved or understudied population, which is the population of international students within the LGBTQ plus community. So Ashish, would you like to kind of introduce yourself and tell everyone a little bit about where you work at?
Sure. Thanks, Wa. So I'm Ashish Agrawal. I graduated from Virginia Tech, and that's where Wa and I met, and we worked on the issues concerning international LGBTQ students. I currently work at a small teaching school in India, where I teach engineering and design faculty development programs for engineering lecturers. So that's pretty much about me. And yeah, over to you, Wa, again.
So first, before we start, we do want to acknowledge the land that we are presenting from. Ashish is presenting from the city of Noida, India. I'm presenting from the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Tamokwa, Hichati, Oconee, and Mekosuki people. So in offering this land acknowledgement, we also want to affirm the indigenous peoples of these lands, and also encourage everyone to look further and be reflective and be curious about the ways in which we're connected, not only to the ancestral lands, but connected to the complex histories and current governances, relationships with indigenous people in the land that we occupy. So we've attached these additional links below the land acknowledgement. One is a guide to indigenous land acknowledgement, and another one that we really appreciate, which is how to go beyond the land acknowledgement. How do we reflect on how to restore and have true reconciliation for the damages of colonization and how its stellar impacts on indigenous people. So we wanted to include that as well. So for today, our agenda is to cover a number of things. We know that there's not always a lot of time, so we're going to try to quickly go through this as best as possible. The first thing we're going to go over is some current research and some literature on international LGBTQ plus students. After that, we will highlight the specific needs of how come it is important. Why are we all here to learn about this topic and to further our understanding of this unique population. We're also going to address some LGBTQ plus issues from a more global perspective. So we're really hoping to decolonize and to look at this not only from a Western lens. Ashish is going to share a lot more as well about Across Borders at VT. This is an international student organization specific to LGBTQ issues that we both started when we were at Virginia Tech, and he's going to share a lot of stories and experiences from that. And then finally, in our last 20 minutes, we're going to talk about a vignette to just garner, where you're at, what questions you may have, how you might approach an issue where it's really highlighting the intersection of sexual orientation, gender identity, and international identity, and then have space for further questions as well. So what do we currently know? So in the literature, they find that there is an incredible increase of international students coming to study abroad in the United States, as well as across the world, with the increase in cultural exchange, These kind of programs, whether it's study abroad or maybe more long-term student studying in different countries, there's a tremendous increase in that area. So this is something that is going to become more and more of something we need to consider more when we're looking at how to look at the needs of students in our colleges, and that they're not always going to be, the representation of students is going to be much more complex and different than what historically or traditionally we may have made assumptions about. And with this increase in international students studying in different countries, there has been also a growing emphasis on how do we look at LGBTQ rights across the globe, and looking at not only sexual orientation and gender identity from a US-centric perspective, but how do we think about it from different cultural perspectives? Even the idea of identity, how we define who we are, how we define what is family, what are relationships, those kinds of things that are weaved into the LGBTQ plus narrative needs to be complexified as we integrate different ideas regarding culture, as well as different customs, traditions. So what we find is that the scholarship, despite this growing emphasis on the cultural intersectional identities, most of the scholarship and literature research still focuses on white middle-class individuals and families. We definitely see, that changing and improving and evolving. I think it's amazing that we even have this kind of symposium here, to a place dedicated to centering these marginalized intersectional experiences. I think that's something that maybe we would not have had maybe a decade or 2 decades ago. So I think there's a lot of work being done to improve that. And there's still more growth and more room to grow, as Joshua was mentioning earlier. So specific to international LGBTQ plus students, they are a population that are often underrepresented and understudied for a variety of reasons, right? Disclosing may be difficult, there may be some complexities. There may be some different risks and challenges to coming out and being present in the scholarship. I also do think that they often get neglected, that this isn't something that a population or group of people that we often think about when we work with LGBTQ communities on campus and within our universities. We're not always as aware of, or not as intentional perhaps, in seeking out their needs and working towards providing resources for them. So what are some of those needs of our international LGBTQ plus students? Some of the relevant issues that is across sort of the scholarship that regarding international students in general is that international students are coming in to whatever is their host country with a sense of understanding who they are and seeking a sense of belongingness. And how do they find their community? They've uprooted where they were and they've gone to a different place. They've taken this incredible risk, right? That to challenge themselves academically and personally, professionally and personally, to get to know a different culture, to get to know a different country. And so they're seeking that sense of belongingness, community, that can be very core to who they are and their experiences in their host country. We also see that a lot of the literature on international students rarely ever addresses sexual and gender identities. It's just sort of invisible in the literature. There's been a number of newer dissertations. Dissertations are very, I feel like, on the edge of these issues, but there has been a number of dissertations exploring this topic, and there's a few publications, and then there's a few in maybe magazines specific to LGBTQ needs, intersectional communities. But overall, we don't see as much literature and research being done in this area. And a lot of the research on international students don't specifically look at that. They're looking at usually belongingness, they're looking at mental health, they're looking at maybe even academic preparedness, decisions regarding that, but they're not integrating the sexual orientation and gender identity piece as much. Then when we looked at the literature on LGBTQ communities and we look at coming out models, we find that oftentimes coming out models do neglect different cultural considerations, even the way that we might define identity within LGBTQ plus coming out models in the US literature. Maybe it's more individualistic and doesn't take into considerations how different identities might be defined culturally. There also is an assumption of a hegemonic whiteness, that the way that there's not as much representation in the way that people think about who they are and how they navigate that sense of community and their identities. Coming out models also tend to perhaps minimize relational aspects that can be core and may be defined differently in different communities. Maybe the focus is more on coming out in maybe even like maybe more of the nuclear family, whereas in some cultures, we're looking at family as not only the immediate nuclear family members of parents and siblings, but even beyond the family, different parts of the community that are like family or very core to that person's experience of who they are. So next, we'd like to just share some quick snippets of stories. This come from a dissertation on international, specifically LGBTQ plus students. I think there's definitely other dissertations focusing on trans students and queer students' experiences, but this is a few stories we'd like to share from that dissertation. So this is a quote from a LGBTQ international student. They said, "I think every LGBTQ international student endures double challenges, coming from both being LGBTQ and being an international student. Therefore, it is important to find a right way to express themselves and seek understanding." The second quote says, "Sometimes you cannot know how you identify. Your identification of yourself is not just about yourself. It's also about the society, the environment, and whether you got the resources to help you discover yourself." So this is another example in which they really indicate that identity is not an individual process, and it's about all the connections within their context, and even beyond their family, their community, their society. Do they have the resources? So highlighting that social context and resources as a core piece of their process of coming into who they are and coming out as well. In our final quote, this person states, "In my case, it took me more than 20 plus years to accept it and be okay with myself. So it's very natural for others to take some time to accept it, grieve the loss of future plans, expectations, and adjust to the new information. Never give up to let people who care about you and your life, and those people may be your family or close friends who you consider and choose as your family." This particular interviewee, they had a very complex sort of coming out experience. They studied in the US for their master's degree, then they went back to their home country, and then they came back here for the doctoral program. So there's this process of, it's not a linear process for a lot of international students. Sometimes there's a going back and forth, and then navigating these complex, these two different cultural contexts in their home country and their host country, at the same time coming into accepting who they are. And they really emphasize that for them, success as an LGBTQ person, it's important to think about not only as an individual process, but how do the people around you, your family and community, come to understand who you are. And that success is very relational in that sense, and not as much of an individualistic perspective. So when we talk specifically about the process of coming into the US and coming out throughout their experience as international students, there could be a risk of not only losing the support of your family, but also of your cultural community. And as you imagine, as an international student, that might, when you come into a host country, that might be a much smaller group of people that you're connecting with, the cultural community you have back home, and also this new cultural community that you're trying to connect with in your host country. So there might be this additional double challenge, as one of the interviewees mentioned earlier in their quote, this double challenge of how do I find a sense of belongingness within this culture and also within who I am as an LGBTQ person. And so they risk losing that support in many different ways. They also may risk not being fully accepted within the LGBTQ plus community in the US because of these cultural differences. We do find that in the current literature, they find that LGBTQ plus international students may experience both heterosexism and cisgenderism, as well as racism and colorism. So they may be experiencing some racism within their host country and even within the LGBTQ plus community. So that's certainly not a surprise for probably most of us who've studied this and who understand that you may be accepted in one way, in one aspect of your identity, but rejected in another aspect of your identity. So that can be kind of difficult to navigate. In addition, there might be certain cultural narratives and legal policies that don't protect or even criminalize LGBTQ plus identities. This can be an obstacle, especially in different kinds of countries in which coming out is not only a matter of not being accepted and being rejected, which is very harmful and damaging, but also a matter of safety, that they may be criminalized, or they may suffer a prison sentence, or there might be certain kinds of policies that not only don't protect, but might put them in harm's way. So sometimes the family and the community is also worried or concerned for that person to come out, because they're worried about their safety, and they're struggling to not only accept identity, but struggling to see how they can succeed or survive even within that cultural and political context. So this brings us to looking, how do we look at LGBTQ plus rights from a global perspective, not only a Western perspective. This is a quote from the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2011. They stated that LGBT rights are human rights. And there's this step towards highlighting that these are human rights, and we need to, as much as possible, globally address this human right that is really lacking a lot of areas of the world. We attach this link here if you want to have a better understanding of some of the laws. It's a map of sexual orientation laws in different languages. There's some information on gender identity on there, but it's limited. And I think there's definitely needs to be a map that kind of addresses trans and queer rights more specifically. I also think that that's really important, because some of these maps, we see that in different countries, there might be a different set of policies and laws for transgender rights versus for sexual orientation, LGBTQ issues. So there might be a lot of differences within that. But this is some interesting data. LGBT people face imprisonment in 78 countries and the death penalty in 5. It is kind of, sometimes it teeters between 5 or 6 countries where there is a death penalty. So this is a very serious issue. And even with the countries that maybe don't imprison or murder LGBTQ people, they still do not provide those protections that are very important to their survival and their success and their existence. I also want to note here to really look at these maps with a critical eye. Ashish will talk about this in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but to look at it with a critical eye, because even though we may assume that being in the United States, right, I may assume that we are much further along in LGBTQ rights, but that's not necessarily the case. And in these maps, we see that the US is not the leading country when it comes to LGBTQ rights. We do want to highlight some organizations if you'd like further information, and if you'd like to take actions towards supporting that. These are some groups that are fighting for LGBTQ rights internationally. We have Amnesty International, IGLA World, who this organization does a lot of bringing together the maps and trying to update information on these LGBTQ rights across the globe. And then we also have Outright Action International, and they focus a lot on advocacy as well as research. So yes, I can definitely share the link to the map. I'm sorry, my chat is in another window, but I'll share the link in just a moment. So I think Ashish is going to talk a little bit more on gay imperialism.
Yeah, thanks, Hoa. So when we think about global LGBTQ rights, one of the things that comes up in literature and conversation in the global South is the idea of gay imperialism, where this thought that the Western countries need to teach the other countries that are not in the West how to be accepting of queer individuals. And that's where it kind of comes to them, the Western countries telling the other folks how they can be more inclusive of LGBTQ population in their own countries. And then that's where this idea comes from. Wow, can you go to the next? Yeah, so there are westernized and colonial overtones in how the narrative of global LGBTQ right sometimes propagates, and these overtones definitely neglects the already existing indigenous and local narratives about including LGBTQ population, especially trans population. So if we think about how several of the native tribes include trans population, a lot of times these global narratives about LGBTQ rights do not include that. And if we think about, again, there are different ways in which different countries look at transgender rights, especially in the country that I come from, India. We actually have acknowledged the third gender long back in legal discourse. And we actually, one can choose to be belonging to one of the three genders, man, woman, and the third gender in India long back, which the US has still not gotten to. And then a lot of times, these Western narratives of global LGBTQ rights ignore those kinds of inclusivity that are already there. And this is not to say that a lot of time, this is not to say a lot of Asian and African countries have reached the level of inclusivity that is desirable, but the whole idea is to kind of highlight that a lot of times when we look at these lenses, when we look at these narratives, the LGBTQ, global LGBTQ rights narratives, they are Western and they sometimes whitewash what is actually being done and has been done in other countries. Right. So these narratives about what has been done in different countries complicate the global divide on LGBTQ protections, and it's not any longer black and white, which a lot of times maps and other resources tend to show. And that is something that we want to also acknowledge while showing that map of global LGBTQ divide. And as you can see in these pictures below the slides, there are different ways in which different cultures acknowledge trans rights and rights of people who belong to alternate genders and sexual orientations. Right. So, and now thinking about the issues that international LGBTQ students face at US universities, and some of which Hoa has already talked about earlier. When Hoa and I were students at Virginia Tech, we came together and talked about, okay, why not we start something that forwards the conversation for international LGBTQ students at the university, and at the same time provides them a safe and protected space to become or try to become who they are. As Hoa mentioned earlier, there are a lot of cultural barriers that prevent international students to actually come out and then start accepting who they are. And that's what led to the birth of Across Borders at VT. So one of the things that we want to acknowledge here is that a lot of times international students in the US are, I mean, regardless of whether they belong to the LGBTQ community or not, they are seen as people of color. But one thing that we want to leave the audience with is the question, are they really people of color? Because the way I thought of, or I understood the people of color identity was that people need to undergo a certain kinds of experiences in a more white dominated society like the US to understand what being a person of color means. And a lot of times international students come from relatively homogeneous cultures where they, while not being white, they still are the racial majorities in their own country, and they have not really lived the experiences of being a person of color in their own country. For example, I myself, one could identify me as a person of color in the US context, but I come from a country where I am from the racial majority background. So I really didn't know until I came to the US what a person of color means and how people of color are actually marginalized in the US. So we actually do want to leave the audience with this question, like when we think of international students as person of color or people of color, how correct are we in making those assumptions? And with that, we, as Hoa talked about the cultural differences in forming relationships and friendships, one of the challenges that international LGBTQ students face, as the literature talks about, is that the difficulties that they have when they try to date or when they try to even make friends with other students in the US, because what counts as friendship or what counts as a romantic relationship varies across cultures, right? And a lot of times what happens is when international students try to make these relationships, whether friendships or romantic relationships, there are these cultural barriers that they have to navigate, which lead to challenges for them. And to top it all, a lot of times international students come from countries where English is not their first language, and that leads to a real communication challenge for them to actually engage with the local population, the domestic population. And then all of this kind of leads to a very complex intersection of uh, lived experiences that international LGBTQ students go through. And to address some of these issues that international LGBTQ students face, we decided to start this group across borders in the fall semester of 2014. Right. So we started with a very simple, or two or three very simple goals. The first one was to obviously provide personal support to international LGBTQ students, but at the same time protect their privacy to the core, right? So one of the things that we realized in our conversations with international LGBTQ students who we knew was that they did want support, right? They did want to be able to connect to people who were belonging to LGBTQ community, and they somehow felt that the mainstream LGBTQ groups on campus were not fully catering to what they actually wanted, right? And a lot of times what they really wanted was a bit more privacy, because they were still very much willing to be a part of their group from their home countries. And a lot of times these groups, they felt, were not very accepting of their gender and sexual minority orientations. So they did want a lot of privacy, but they still wanted to explore what it means to actually fully accept themselves as belonging to gender and sexual minority groups, right? So what we did was we tried to provide them personal support by forming a community of international LGBTQ students, but we did it in a way that we kept their privacy we kept their privacy, or maintained their privacy as much as we could. To the extent that when we actually had meetings, our meetings were never held at public places, and they were always invite-only meetings, right? So we'd meet at someone's house, or sometimes we'll meet at my place or Wa's place or someone else's place. And these meetings were always through individual invitations that we sent to people on their personal phone numbers or email IDs, or whichever means of communication they preferred. The other thing that we worked on was to raise awareness about the issues faced by international LGBTQ students on campus. And we did this through working with the LGBTQ Resource Center on campus, and the Safe Zone program that was being run at Virginia Tech. So what Hoa and I did was to actually create content for an international LGBTQ focused Safe Zone training session called Safe Zone International 101, where we highlighted the issues faced by international LGBTQ students on campus, and talked about the resources that the individuals on campus could use to support international LGBTQ students, right? So we raised awareness about these needs. We also partnered with other student organizations. So we partnered with Cranwell International Center that looked after the needs and welfare of international students in general. We worked with Hockey Pride at Virginia Tech. That was the overarching LGBTQ resource group and student group at Virginia Tech. And we also partnered with Queer Grad Professional and Allies to again work with them on for different events and different initiatives to raise awareness about the needs of international LGBTQ students. So one of the things that we did, which was really fun, and everyone from our group enjoyed it, and it also created a lot of awareness and cognizance on campus, was to participate in the annual street fair as across borders, where we put up stalls for food from different parts of the world from where our community members belong, and we would cook food together and sell these food at the street fair. So these are some of the pictures of the street fair and us cooking together. And now, so to as we are at the end of this conversation, I quickly want to highlight a few things. When we deal with international students, what we want to kind of give to audiences the take-home message is to think about the importance of intersectionality, right? They're not just LGBTQ students, or they're not just international students. They have these different identities, be it national identity or gender or sexual orientation related identity, or cultural or ethnic identity, or sometimes even race based identity. And one needs to be very cognizant of how all of these identities kind of come into play while they explore being who they are at US universities. And that is why it's important to bring multiple stakeholders together to continuously engage in conversations about the needs of international LGBTQ students. And these multiple stakeholders include, but are not limited to, students, faculty, administrators, student centers on campus, study abroad programs, resource centers for LGBTQ students, or even offices for diversity and inclusion on campus. So the idea is to kind of engage with all of these people whenever and however we can, to kind of raise awareness about the needs or special needs of international LGBTQ students. So now Hoa will talk about the vignette that it's kind of a brainstormer or a brain tickler for the audience.
Yes, so this vignette actually came from one of our Safe Zone trainings that we created to focus on international students within the LGBTQ plus community. So I'll just quickly read the vignette. It says, you attend an LGBTQ plus event on a US university campus. During the open discussion of the event, one participant who is an international student and new to the group asked questions about the experience of being homosexual on campus. A few other participants stated they were uncomfortable with the use of the word homosexual, which is regarded as outdated and offensive. By the end of the event, no one addressed the students' questions and avoided engaging with them. So it's just kind of like you kind of to think about what might be happening between the international student and the other participants who are generally US domestic students. So if you'd like to comment in the chat, or if you'd like to kind of speak up. I don't know how the mic situation works, Joshua, but whichever way. Okay, so I see Russell says possibly a language barrier. Okay, absolutely. I think sometimes the language we use here are around LGBTQ identities are fleshed out in a way that comes from a very Western or specific cultural context. So absolutely, there might be a language or cultural difference, absolutely, between what terms are used that's okay or appropriate for the LGBTQ community. Okay, I see some of you in the cultural context. As Ashish says, homosexual is a perfectly acceptable term in India, and that's true too. I'm Vietnamese, and in Vietnam, homosexual is actually the term to use, and it's actually a less offensive term than other terminology that would be regarded as derogatory. So thank you, Ashish, for sharing that. I think situations like this require empathy to recognize that language is situated. Yes, thank you for saying that, because I think sometimes we come to the table and we feel like this is the right way to do things in the LGBTQ community. And I think there are multiple things happening, right? There might be something that is just to acknowledge that the participants who are uncomfortable may have their own experiences with the word homosexual, may experience it as a microaggression, all those things. And at the same time, the international student who is whose perspective is not maybe empathized as much in this context, because they do come from a different culture and from a different knowledge base of what is okay or not okay. And to also challenge that, how come it's sort of, we're always asking the person immigrating or the person who's international to accommodate to us. So I definitely agree that empathy is important. There's a question on what happens if the international student dislikes the term queer, which is the current dominant terminology. That's a great question. Ashish, I'm curious what you think about that. But I think for us, it's sort of, we talk about how the language is always evolving in culture. And I think the point is to really if that's a concern, then to talk about what it means, where does queer originated? What does it mean? I also think, I guess what I've learned about the word queer too is that sometimes queerness is adopted as almost like a new terminology in Western culture, but I do think queerness exists in a lot of different cultures already. So I think it depends on where the international student is coming from, their understanding of it, and we want to make it a conversation rather than a one and done. We all agree this is offensive. We all agree queer is not or isn't okay. I think we have to make space for that complexity instead of coming in with the frame of this is the right language to use, because we have that cultural context that we all bring. Ashish, did you have anything else you'd like to add or anything, your response to that question?
I mean, well, so for my PhD research, I actually studied the experiences of international teaching assistants or international GTAs, and the language piece kind of keeps coming in and kept coming in for my own research. And so one of the things that I have kind of learned with language is that, like, I mean, even if somebody doesn't come from an English speaking country, which by itself is a very problematic terminology to use, but if somebody doesn't come from an English speaking country, there are certain terms and words that mean differently in different cultures, right? And it is quite possible that queer might actually be offensive to certain international students. And the only answer that I have usually is to, again, as somebody rightly pointed out, to be more empathetic to acknowledging that there are differences in language uses, and one needs to kind of just have an open channel for communicating what a certain word or a certain expression means in certain kinds of cultures, and how can we kind of find a midway in using language that is more acceptable to almost everyone who is present in the room.
I agree. And so our next question is just thinking about what steps might we take in response to the situation. And I think we gave this vignette because this is something that actually that did take place, and that international student didn't feel as welcome at that LGBTQ event. And to think that might have been their one, that opportunity they would actually felt comfortable to reach out and try to learn more about the community and be more within it. So I think, some of the things that you've already mentioned, the steps towards like empathy, understanding, maybe exploring the language, having those conversations, and creating a culture of learning from multiple sides rather than from a one cultural perspective. I think we'll go to the next slide. And looking at this time as well. And absolutely, please email us if you have further questions. I'll link our email soon. So Ashish will talk about some of our questions for you.
Right. So, I mean, just to close it, close the conversation and the presentation, I mean, we do want to leave the audience with thoughts on, or actually not, like, we don't really have thoughts, but questions on how one can make university campuses work toward more inclusion of international LGBTQ plus students. How can we be actually intentional about moving away from US-centric narratives of queerness? And that's something that's quite important to kind of talk about if we want to include international LGBTQ plus students. And finally, and most importantly, what is it that the US community can learn from other LGBTQ plus movements in other countries and cultures around the world? And I personally do believe that there's a lot that can be learned. And as we linked or cited in one of our slides, that there is a very, very clear imperialistic overtone in the LGBTQ movements that the West kind of sometimes tries to propagate, which neglects the advances that are being made in other countries. So one thing that we can actually think about as educators, or educators in the US can actually think about, is what is it that these educators can learn from other movements, and what is it that can actually be sometimes adopted in the US that might make not only the experiences of international LGBTQ students richer, but also provide a new direction for the LGBTQ movement, a new and more inclusive direction for LGBTQ movement in the US itself. So that's kind of all that we wanted to talk about. Thank you for being a lovely and engaging audience. These are some of the references that we used, and that's pretty much it. We are happy to take questions depending on how much time we have.
I think we are at the end of time, but we will stay on to answer any questions. I know some people may have to move to the next section, but yes, please email us if you have further questions. I also want to acknowledge one of our participants had a question about how do we think about international students within the backdrop of the anti-Asian as well as the Black Lives Matter movement. I definitely think, there are some intersections with that, and just thinking about how some of the hate and racism, one of you mentioned xenophobia, that it's racism and also this sense of looking at people as perpetual foreigners, right? That you're not one of us, and that there's that kind of hatred and violence towards people who, even if they have been here for a while, or even if they are here and they are contributing to the society and they're newcomers, but they are contributing to our communities, that people see them as being other in that sense. So we want to acknowledge there are certainly intersections between that as well. Thank you, everyone. Any other questions or anything? Thank you for attending. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the share. And again, please email us if you need anything at all. Bye, enjoy the rest of your conference, your symposium.
Okay, I guess everyone has left now.
I think so. I don't know if I should stop the cloud recording or let me just.
I think the recording was stopped already. Wait, it still says it's recording. Wait, should I just click on, okay, stop recording?
Okay.